here beside the Cathedral of Christ the King in Mullingar, and the Cathedral of Christ the King contains many interesting artworks, but the most significant artworks are the two mosaics situated either side of the sanctuary area, one in the chapel of St. Patrick and the other in the chapel of St. Anne. And both these mosaics were done by the Russian-born artist Boris Anrep, and they're the only examples of Boris Anrep's work anywhere in Ireland. So we're really privileged in Mullingar to have these works in the cathedral. And Boris Anrep was one of the most significant mosaic artists of the 20th century. He was born in St. Petersburg in 1883 into a very aristocratic family. His father at one stage served in the Russian Parliament, the Duma. He was related distantly to the Empress Catherine the Great and to King Charles XII of Sweden. And Boris Anrep was partly educated in the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv, and he visited England and France first as a young man. He spent a year living in Buckinghamshire, just north of London, when he was in his teens. And he went to university in St. Petersburg and then moved to Western Europe. He studied art in Paris and in London, and he was living in London in the years before the First World War, and he became very friendly with members of the group of writers and artists known from the region of London in which they lived and worked as the Bloomsbury Group. People like Virginia Woolf, the novelist, the artist Dora Carrington, the writer-biographer Lytton Strachey, and many others. And he also met Augustus John, the artist, and through Augustus John's sister Gwen, he became friendly with a woman called Helen Maitland. They had 2 children and they were married in 1918. When the First World War started, Boris Anrep returned to his homeland, and he served in the Russian Imperial Army from 1915 through 1917, serving mostly in Galicia, which is now part of Poland and of Ukraine. And it was while he was serving in the military that he met the young Anna Akhmatova, who was 6 years younger than him. Anna Akhmatova is one of the greatest names in 20th century Russian literature. Indeed, she has a claim to be one of the greatest 20th century poets in any language. And she and Boris Anrep had a short and very passionate affair during the war years. She was married, but her marriage had broken up, and they would never forget each other. In 1917, after the revolution, when the communists came to power, Boris Anrep, who had just was moved to London to work there, he knew he could never come back while the communists were in power. He would have been in acute danger. And he wanted Anna to come with him to London or to Paris, but she couldn't bear to leave Russia. Now, Anna was Ukrainian. She was born in Odessa. On her father's side, she was descended from Ukrainian Cossacks. She also had Tatar nationality. The Tatars are a Muslim people who have been in Russia for over 700 years, and she also had Russian blood, and her first language was Russian. She was educated at Kiev University, but she spent most of her adult life living in St. Petersburg. And Anna couldn't really bear to leave Russia. She loved the country despite its government, and so she stayed. And before they parted, she gave Boris Anrep a black ring which had belonged to her Tatar grandmother, and he used to wear it around his neck for many years. It was kind of a good luck talisman. He later lost it, but they remained in a sense obsessed about each other. He never wrote to her, mainly because he was afraid of what would happen to her if she received letters from the West. But he was constantly painting her, and she was constantly writing about him. At least 34 of her poems are directly about him or mention him. and many of his artworks depict her as he knew her and remembered her, this young, very striking woman. And he worked in Paris, he worked in London, he had many art commissions, including works for the National Gallery in London. He also did work in Scotland, and his works in the National Gallery included a depiction of Anna as compassion in a piece about the modern virtues. During the Second World War, when he was in Paris, he was served with the French resistance. And in the 1940s, after the war, his work in London was seen by the then Bishop of Meath, Bishop John Dalton. Bishop Dalton liked Anrup's work, and he commissioned him to do a mosaic for the Chapel of St. Patrick in the cathedral. When the cathedral was built, it had many fine artworks created in its interior, mostly by the firm of William Early and Sons of Dublin, but they were lacking works for the two of the side chapels. And so the St. Patrick's side chapel was the one in which Boris Anrup did his first work here. And it showed St. Patrick lighting the first Easter fire up at Slane around the year 433, the first time Easter was celebrated in Ireland. Now, it is a very striking work, not least for its depiction of St. Patrick, because normally Patrick is depicted as an old man with a long white beard and a mitre. This is a young man, and there's no mitre, and his cross is the kind of cross really of the Eastern Church, because of course Boris Anrup had been raised in the Russian Orthodox Church. So a young, vigorous man with a brown beard who is crushing a snake underfoot. You can see in one side the old pagan god of death, Crom Cruach, his altar falling over, snakes slithering away. Up above Patrick's head there is again a quite striking depiction of Christ enthroned in heaven, and it is very much Christ as depicted in the Russian Orthodox Church's iconography. He's a quite commanding figure in heaven, and he's holding the Bachal Isa, which was a crozier said to have been given to St. Patrick by an angel as a gift from our Lord, and a relic deemed to be the Bachal Isa was venerated for centuries until the Reformation, when it was destroyed as idolatrous. But that Bachal Isa is in Christ's hand. They're the figures of the daughters of the High King Leary, who become Christians. They're wearing their white baptismal robes. So it is a very striking work. 300,000 pieces of stone and glass, most of the work done in his studios in Paris, and then everything was kind of packed up and brought to Mullingar, and the final work put into place, rather like assembling a jigsaw puzzle. And it was finished by the summer of 1948. So the St. Patrick's Chapel mosaic, that was the first of Anrup's work. Now, by this time Bishop Dalton had moved on to Armagh, where he became Archbishop, but his successor, Bishop John Kine, was also very impressed by Anrup's work. And 6 years after the St. Patrick mosaic went into place, the Marian year came around, this major year running from December 1953 to December 1954, dedicated to honouring and venerating Our Lady. And up and down the country, statues of Our Lady were put up, and there were many pageants and other celebrations. And for the Marian year in Mullingar, Bishop Kine decided to commission a mosaic work for the chapel dedicated to Mary's mother, St. Anne. And Boris Anrup was chosen to do the work. And what he produced is one of the most striking artworks, I think, anywhere in Ireland. The Chapel of St. Anne, when you go in there, you are confronted by a beautiful piece. It almost shimmers in the light. Again, 300,000 pieces of glass and stone. There's a set of steps in the picture, and it alone contains over 25,000 pieces of stone. And this work, I think, meant more to Boris Anrep than St. Patrick. He apparently knew very little about St. Patrick when he took on the commission. St. Anne, on the other hand, was rooted in his culture and in his church. St. Anne is revered in the Russian Orthodox Church, much in the same way St. Bridget would be here in Ireland. And when he came to do the work, he also remembered once more the woman who had been the love of his life 40 years earlier, Anna Akhmatova. The mosaic depicts the presentation of Mary in the temple, a story you won't find in the Gospels. It's in one of the many other Gospels deemed not to make the final authentic cut by the early church. But there is a Gospel story in one of the apocryphal Gospels that says that Mary lived in the temple in Jerusalem from the age of 3 until she reached puberty. Her holiness was so evident even from her babyhood. And so what you see is Mary being presented to the temple, to the high priest, by her parents, St. Anne and St. Joachim. And the figure of Anne dominates the whole mosaic. Tall, with large hands, and apparently the large hands were meant to symbolize St. Anne's generosity. When you look at the face, you're looking at the face of Anna Akhmatova. There's no doubt about that, because we can see her. There are portraits of her by other artists, there are photographs of Anna, and there is no doubt at all that it's her face. Indeed, Anrep often used the faces of people he knew in his work. For example, the novelist Virginia Woolf appears in a couple of his other art pieces. So it's Anna, and her face is serene, the whole figure of Anna. This is the face of this great poet, the poet that he loved, the poet he could never forget any more than she could forget him. And he gives away the game in a way, because above Anna St. Anne's head is written Anna, not Anne, Anna. And that is and her costume, her clothes. Her clothes are again also quite striking. I don't think it's coincidence that she's wearing blue and yellow, the colours of Ukraine. Anna was Ukrainian, and in 1954 they celebrated the 300th anniversary of a union between Ukraine, or Eastern Ukraine, and Russia. And to mark that anniversary, the then Soviet Premier Khrushchev, who was himself born in Ukraine, gave the Crimean Autonomous Republic, which had been part of the Russian Federation, to Ukraine. So here is this figure of this Ukrainian-born poet wearing the colours of Ukraine. And again, when you look up, you see the figure of Mary enthroned in heaven, and once more it's very much Mary as she is depicted in the Orthodox Church's iconography. This is Mary very much the Queen of Heaven, the Theotokos, the God-bearer, regarded in the Orthodox Church as almost the co-redeemer of humanity along with her Son. And looking down, you see the background of Middle Eastern background of Jerusalem, of young attendants in the temple, gazing at the young Mary, who's depicted wearing white, almost like a communion dress, but of course Mary was Jewish, and it's an astonishing piece of work, and it's something that I think very much reflected, as I said, his own religious beliefs, his culture. It reflected his Russian culture, but also it reflected once more, as in so much of his work, his feelings for this extraordinary woman. And Anna Akhmatova was an immensely gifted poet who lived through a terrible period in Russian history. She survived the Stalinist purges, in which her husband and her son were arrested. She survived the horrors of wartime. Leningrad, as it was known then, St. Petersburg, during the German siege. At times She was banned by the Soviet authorities. At times she was allowed to publish, but at other times she was abused in print in the most vulgar way by Stalin's people. A decade after he completed the mosaic in the cathedral here, depicting Anna as Saint Anne, Boris Anrep met Anna Akhmatova for one final time. She had been allowed out of the Soviet Union to receive an honorary doctorate from Oxford University. She was disappointed that Anrep, who at that stage was living in London, did not come to meet her there. So she travelled back to Paris, and they met in Paris and had dinner together. But it was a disappointing encounter. Time had passed. They were both much older, much fatter, as Akhmatova noted. Time had not been kind to either of them. And what was sadder really was not just the fact that he was no longer the handsome young army officer and she was no longer the beautiful young poet, but the fact that they really found nothing to say to each other. Everything that really they'd had to say had been expressed in poetry and in art. So it was a rather disappointing encounter for them both, and one that perhaps should not have happened. Anna died the following year in 1966, and Boris Anrep died in 1969. But their work is immortalised, as the work of all artists, of course, is. Our poetry remains among the greatest examples of 20th century literature, and his art remains among the most significant mosaic artwork of the century. And there are two copies of the St. Anne mosaic now in Russia. One is in the Irish Embassy in Moscow, and the other is in a house in St. Petersburg, in which Anna Akhmatova lived for many years, and which is now a museum in her honour. So they're part of the cultural heritage of Ireland, certainly, these mosaics, but we can also, particularly the St. Anne work, describe them as being part of the cultural heritage in exile of Russia and of Ukraine. And in these sad times, we're remembering that in some places, in some ways, the cultural heritage of Ukraine and Russia did mingle together. Anna Akhmatova and Boris Anrep represented a very different Russia to the Russia of President Putin. And they also represented Ukraine, a country linked to Russia in many ways, but also, of course, very distinct in its own culture and its civilization. And in Anna Akhmatova too, a poet whose work transcends borders and hate, and a poet whose own ethnic heritage was a mingling of various cultures: Russian, Ukrainian, Tatar, Christian and Muslim.